All right, thanks. Great crowd. Last time we were here for Finance Connect, it was an incredible snowstorm.
Yeah.
A lot of people.
Captive audience.
Captive audience. They didn't
Couldn't
leave
go
for
anywhere.
3 days. We ended up eating half the crowd. Much more beautiful day. We got very lucky today, and we're very lucky to have you here. So thanks, Jeff. Wanted to talk about a couple different areas. One is a big vision for LinkedIn, this idea of the economic graph. And then two is how you handle disruption and how others in the crowd can think about being disrupted and getting ahead of coming disruption. So let's talk about the economic graph. This was I'd love for you to define it, but just to give a little context, the economic graph is a very big idea for LinkedIn. It's a way of thinking about where LinkedIn is going in the future. When I heard it as an employee, having come from other places with big visions, my immediate thought was, very nice, I never have to think about this again. And what's interesting to watch is how you
heard that before.
Yeah, this is you hear
know.
everyone has a mission statement at a company, and it's something that you get on a notebook at some point, and then that's it. At LinkedIn, you've worked very hard to actually turn this into to operationalize it. So would you start just explaining what the vision is for the economic graph?
Well, taking a step back, we draw a very clear distinction between mission and vision, where a mission, our mission, is an overarching objective that is measurable, realizable, and hopefully inspirational. Whereas the vision is the dream. That's true north, and that's why we come into work every day. And it's not necessarily something that a company believes it can achieve, but it is something that everyone aims for. And when we codified our mission and vision, our mission is to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. Our vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. One of the key distinctions between the two is with regard to our mission, our addressable opportunity there are knowledge workers. There's about 780 million knowledge workers in the world, and that includes what we call professionals and then students or pre-professionals. Whereas with regard to the global workforce, there's over 3 billion people in the global workforce. So there's a key distinction there. And when we codified our mission and vision over 6 years ago, we had, when I first joined the company, we were about 32 million members. That was December of 2008. And that addressable opportunity, 780 million professionals and students, seemed like a very distant goal. And sure enough, we grew much faster than we anticipated. So a couple of years ago, we started thinking about what was next. We recognized that pretty shortly we were going to be approaching the midway mark in terms of that immediate addressable opportunity. Today, we're over 350 million members. And so for the first time in my career, started this path where we had an opportunity to operationalize our vision. And it's a lot of fun. And it starts by asking yourself the question, what would it take to make that dream or that vision statement a reality? And that question, what would it take, it's incredibly powerful and liberating. And if you set your sights too low, sometimes you'll never challenge yourself to think bigger. Sometimes you'll never challenge yourself to question conventional wisdom. But by asking the question, what would it take, it unleashes all of this creative energy. And it unleashes the sense that anything is possible. And so we started asking ourselves the question, what would it take to make the vision a reality? What would it take to not just connect the world's professionals, 780 million people, but create economic opportunity for over 3 billion people in the global workforce?
And when you say economic opportunity, what does that mean exactly?
So I think it means at least 3 different things. For people who are out of work, for people who are unemployed, for students who are graduating for the first time, it's helping them get a job. And when you start to break that down, you realize right now the state of the global economy, particularly youth-based unemployment, it's at crisis proportions. And it's in most countries, developed countries, you'll see youth-based unemployment at 2x the general unemployment rate. That's certainly the case in the US. And in certain Southern European countries, you see youth-based unemployment north of 50%. That's got to be addressed. And then you've got folks who have been unemployed for so long it becomes almost prohibitively challenging for them to get work. These are folks who've been in the workforce for quite some time. And there's this widening skills gap where the pace of innovation now on a global basis is exceeding our ability to retrain the workforce for the jobs that will be and not just the jobs that once were. So just helping people get a job, I think that's part of creating economic opportunity. I think second is for those that are gainfully employed but not happy. You know, there's a lot of folks who do work and they're not engaged and they're not inspired by that work, so they're not even close to being as productive as they otherwise could be. It's helping those folks find their dream jobs. And we're in a position where we can do that. We can do that as a platform by virtue of passive candidate recruiting, where recruiters can do a search for someone with the ideal qualifications, whether or not that individual is actively looking for a job. We can do that in ways where people can see opportunities. Opportunities can come to them through our members, through organizations, in ways that heretofore would not have been possible. And then the third thing is we're in a position where people who are in their dream jobs can leverage our platform to kind of help other people and create economic opportunity for others, and to be great at the job that they're already in. And you can do that by virtue of leveraging all of the information, the business intelligence, the knowledge that is flowing through our ecosystem. So those are at least three different ways in which we define creating economic opportunity. And
when you talk about mapping this out, this is a worldwide plan to have all of these digitally findable, connectable. You can see them everywhere. It's a big idea. You're the CEO. You get to have these big ideas. How do you deal with people though who are working on a quarterly basis? They have things that they have to do every week. They have bugs they've got to fix. How do you make them think about this bigger picture rather than the stuff that they have to do in order to get raises, promoted, to get the next job internally they want?
So I think there's multiple dimensions to the answer. First is making sure we're all on the same page with regard to what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And we had this vision statement to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And I think one of the reasons Dan and I think a lot of folks would traditionally hear a statement like that, maybe write it down, in the notebook on day one of onboarding and then kind of tuck it aside or say, well, isn't that nice? Is because it doesn't provide much in the way of detail. There's not a roadmap there, it's just a vision statement. It's not a vision roadmap. It's not a vision that's accompanied by a set of strategic objectives or measurable goals. And so for us, we want to step further when we started saying, well, how are we going to make this a reality? What would it take? And that's where we came up with the vision to develop the world's first economic graph, which is basically a digital mapping of the global economy. So our goal is to make sure that there is a profile on LinkedIn for every member of the global workforce. That's all 3 billion plus people. There is a profile for every company in the world. There's roughly 60 to 70 million companies on a global basis when you include small and medium-sized businesses. We want there to be a digital representation for every job that is not only digitally accessible, but in total. And that's probably somewhere on the order of 10 to 20 million opportunities. A digital representation for every skill required to obtain those jobs. Presence for every university or higher educational organization that enables people to acquire the skills to get those jobs. And then to build a platform that enables every individual, every company, and every university the ability to share their professionally relevant knowledge if they're so inclined. That's something they want to do. And then we want to take a step back and allow capital, all forms of capital, intellectual capital, working capital, and human capital, to flow to where it can best be leveraged. And in doing so, we want to help lift and transform the global economy. So that goes beyond a statement. That starts to provide a framework through which we can make that possible. But that's not enough, because that's still an abstraction. So then you have to ask yourself the question, well, if we're serious about this, what would it take? What would it take to grow from 350 million professionals that are currently on LinkedIn to 780 million knowledge workers and students or pre-professionals to 3 billion people in the global workforce? And each one of those milestones or stepping stones requires a different way to approach things. With regard to companies, we had several million companies on the platform active, and we started asking ourselves the question, well, what would it take to grow from 3 million and maybe double that? And doubling's a pretty big deal, 3 to 6 million or 7 million in a short period of time. But that's only 1/10 of the 70 million addressable. What would it take to hit that? And it requires thinking about things in a completely different way. With regard to jobs, when I first started at the company, we had somewhere on the order of 8,000 job listings on LinkedIn. That was in early 2009, December 2008 was when I first started. And we had identified an addressable opportunity of several 100,000 high-value white-collar professional jobs, which was right in our sweet spot. And if you ask yourself the question, what would it take to have all jobs, you start to go way beyond several 100,000. You need 10 million, eventually 20 million. And that required us to think and approach that part of our business in a completely different way. And we went out and we acquired a company called Bright. And within 12 months of that acquisition, we had grown the number of jobs on LinkedIn from 340,000 to 3.4 million. And rather than celebrate that, the team is well aware of the fact that's not the end game. Now we have to get that to 2x and then 10 million on our way to 20 million.
And are you pushing them, or do they know this is what they have to do?
It's a great question. So at some point, you want it to take on a life of its own. But as David Gergen once said, David Gergen, communications advisor, director to 4 different White House administrations, both Republican and Democrat, which gives you a sense of how good he is at what he does. He talks about the importance and the power of repetition, and all great leaders throughout history have understood the importance and the value of repetition. A friend of mine read a book by David Gergen and interpreted his thoughts and perspective on that as you have to repeat yourself as a leader trying to get a point across, especially to a big group. You have to repeat yourself so often that you get sick of hearing yourself say it, and only then will people begin to internalize it. And at first I thought that was a tongue-in-cheek reference, and the more you start to practice it, the more real you recognize that it is. And there's a lot of senior executives in the audience, and I'm sure like me, you all have experienced a situation where by virtue of your seniority, you thought just because you were telling your team something, it was done. You say it once, you're like, all right, well, this is as good as over. Right. The team's gonna execute this, we're all set. And like months later, you ask the team how they're progressing on that particular goal or objective, and they're like, what are you talking about? It's like, what do you mean, what am I talking about? I thought we talked about this. They're busy, you're busy, you can't assume anything. And so to your point, Dan, I hadn't been asked that question in the context of the economic graph. There was a period when we first started talking about this, particularly in the area of jobs liquidity, where I would have meetings with that team from time to time, and they were well on their way to about 350,000, which was the immediate term goal, or intermediate term goal. And at the conclusion of some of those meetings, I'd say, don't forget, economic graph, this is before we went all in, economic graph, we need all the jobs, and they'd be like, okay, we'll get right on that. And it's like you, when you first hear those vision statements, you're kind of like, whatever, let's get back to work. And 3, 4, maybe 5 meetings into that progression over the course of, I want to say, 6 or 9 months, there was a meeting, and my conviction on the economic graph just kept getting stronger and stronger. But I was looking at the team and recognizing that I thought they believed that was a nice to have. We're a true north. And at the conclusion of that meeting, I said, guys, you do realize we're going to do this. This has to happen. So this is not something that's pie in the sky. We need a roadmap and a strategy. And I think it was around the time of that meeting that the switch flipped. And so they rolled up their sleeves and they came up with this amazing strategy, and we went out and we started to execute it, and here we are. And that's not the only place in our business that's occurred. There's some influencers in the audience, Jill and Mohammed, who were here just previously. And when we first started that program, we had 500 influencers, professional luminaries on a global basis, writing in long form. And that was the specific vision of a team, and they executed beautifully, and it blew away our expectations. But in the context of the economic graph, remember that 6th dimension, which is to ensure that anyone who wants to share professionally relevant knowledge can. And so that team started to ask themselves the question, what would it take to enable everybody to write in long form on LinkedIn? That's a very different approach, a very different strategy, a very different roadmap, a different set of resources required to make that happen and to realize that. So, it's a combination, but there's going to be clarity's required, conviction's required, because people, when you do start taking it seriously, there's going to be a lot of naysayers. If it's truly a vision, it hasn't happened for a reason. And more often than not, that kind of vision, it threatens people. It threatens the status quo. It forces people to operate outside of their comfort zone. And their knee-jerk reaction will typically be to naysay and to come up with all the reasons you can't make it happen. And so that's where leadership kicks in. And you have to have that clarity. You have to have the courage of your convictions. You have to be able to effectively communicate the clarity of the vision, the courage of the conviction, and you coalesce a group of people around you to go make it happen. And at this point, I don't need to be in the room to ask people what would it take. Right. And that's part of the joy of working at LinkedIn.
So a lot of repetition, a lot of making sure that vision gets actually turned into, I assume it's kind of a snowball effect, where as other groups start doing it, you watch, so if they did it, the jobs team did this, we need to do this also. One of the things that comes out of this is you're talking about doing massive change at scale. And I think this is a room, you've had a lot of financial professionals, almost all financial professionals. There's an industry that is at the beginning of a massive, what people are predicting is going to be a massive disruption cycle coming. There was a story today by Don Pepper, an author on LinkedIn, where he said there are only two kinds of financial services executives today: the people who realize that this is imminent and that disruption to their industry is imminent, and the people who aren't paying attention. If that's the case, what would you tell? Let's say you're the CEO of a major financial services company. You are facing millennials who don't trust banks and financial services companies. You've got a middle class that is disappearing, so a lot of them are becoming unbanked, and the rich are finding other methods.
Unbanked?
Unbanked, that's right.
Is that a new expression in the industry, or did Dan just make that up?
No, that's
Show of hands on unbanked. How many people have used unbanked before? All right. There's a post in
I'm
there.
with it.
There's
There's
less than
of
half,
America.
though. I think you're on the leading edge of that
That's
curve.
right.
Unbanked. Actually, someone should check for the URL right now.
That's right.
I'm being serious. Unbanked.com is pretty cool.
I'm disrupting the language,
Yeah,
Jeff.
okay. I'm
And-
trying to execute on it. Let's go build the site.
And then you've got software eating the world, including the financial services.
Mark's getting a lot of mileage
That's a
out
great
of that
line.
Wall Street Journal piece, yeah.
That was a great line.
Software's
Better than
eating the
unbanking.
world.
What do you do when you're in that situation? How do you, number one, how do you think about leading a big company with people who are about to get disrupted? And two, how do you either get ahead of it or embrace it, or what?
So I'm the CEO of
You're the CEO.
So first thing, I'm going to see if there's an opportunity at LinkedIn for the CEO. I'm going to see if I like my current job. I want to be in my current job. CEO of a financial services company. So a few different thoughts come to mind immediately. First is to be very honest with myself, with the leadership, with the company about the challenges that we face. I think all too often people instinctually understand that there are going to be changes coming. There's going to be serious disruption. There may be cannibalization. The ability for the company to continue to execute on the path and strategy it had already developed may not be possible on a going forward basis. And it's a very natural thing to kind of put your head in the sand and just wish it away. And hope in that case is not a strategy. So you have to be brutally honest. I think starting with yourself. Because if you're the CEO or a senior executive, in part you're in that position because of a strategy that you had already put into place that you're executing on. And you have to know when it's time to start to think about a different approach. And if you're not willing to cannibalize your business, you need to recognize that somebody else is inevitably going to. So that's, I guess, the starting off point, is just being really honest with yourself about those threats and about the disruption. I would also hope that we're not too late to the game in terms of understanding the disruption that's taking place. Ideally, you want to be as proactive as possible. If you have the clarity to define a long-term vision, you may or may not be perfectly right when it comes to that vision. And there are going to be changes all along the way. There's going to be changes in the environment. There's going to be new innovations. There's going to be competitive breakthroughs. Your own company may develop things or see demand in areas that you hadn't originally anticipated. And so it's important that you develop the ability to be dynamic. So you can, at time, start to understand proactively where that change is going to be happening. At the company, for example, at LinkedIn, we have a very clear sense of where we want to be longer term, qualitatively, in terms of both our vision and mission, the framing of that, our strategic objectives, but also quantitatively. So we have very specific goals in place in terms of 3 years out and even 7 years out. The 7-year out, that's going to change over time. Of course it's going to change. But it provides us a roadmap to say, hey, this doesn't look like we're on the same trajectory that we would have expected. We're exceeding it, or for whatever reason, we're not where we wanted to be. And then you start asking yourselves the question, why is that? And what can we do about it? And to the extent you're charting that path much longer term, you can be way more proactive about it. Because if you're reacting to the competitive landscape, if you're reacting to change in the industry, far more often than not, it's too late. Especially if you're not in a leadership position, especially if you don't have sustainable competitive advantage. You never want to be in a position where you're reacting to the competition in a meaningful way, because now you're playing their game and not playing your own game. That's the fastest way to lose. So I think having the ability and the perspective to put yourself in a position to clearly define what it is you're trying to accomplish, recognize when things are changing, have the flexibility. Jeff Bezos once said, I love this expression, part of Amazon's success comes from the fact that they're stubborn on vision but flexible on details. And so I think all of that goes into the mix in terms of how to navigate that kind of landscape. I think for the larger companies, I think we have some of the largest financial services companies in the world represented here today. You know, you look at the Microsofts of the world. I mean, today's Microsoft under Satya. And he's making decisions seemingly every week, if not every day, that defy conventional wisdom. Partnering with a competitor. Developing applications for somebody else's operating system, opening up their operating system in ways that would never have been conceivable a decade ago. And it's really refreshing to see a company that big, at that kind of scale, with that kind of legacy, operating so dynamically. I'm on the board of Intuit, and I think Brad Smith has done an incredible job navigating and transitioning Intuit into the cloud. It used to be a software-based business. And this is traditional software in shrink wrap. You go into a store to buy. And you have to be willing to make those bold bets. You have to be willing to disrupt yourself. And I think both Satya and Brad are doing an incredible job of that today.
It's great. And then we're going to wrap it up, but I want to touch on one thing that deals with this and with what Jill and Mohammed were talking about, which is the idea of disruption and scale. What the technology companies bring is a lot of goodness and also a lot of growth that comes without job growth. How do you think about, when you look at the economy in the future and you look at companies that can do a lot with a very few people, what happens to not just the developing economies, but how do the economies deal with a future where there aren't that many, where you don't need that many people doing all these jobs?
Well, hopefully, as the past has shown us and as history has shown us, those innovations, those breakthroughs that may be reducing the need for jobs in specific areas are creating productivity gains that enable us to invest to create opportunities elsewhere. And I think there's at least two different dimensions of that on a global basis that countries and regions and companies and organizations need to be heavily investing in. The first is education, and that's both primary school education and vocational training. They're both incredibly important. The challenge with primary school education is that will require a generation to really get right. And speaking with regard to the United States, you see some of our educational practices, best practices, are just incredibly antiquated. They were developed for, summer vacation is all about letting the kids out so they could harvest the fields. It was really developed during a time of farming was the predominant segment of the industry and the economy. And then you had the Industrial Revolution, and you've got assembly lines, and you've got people learning by rote, sitting in rows, and that reflects, a division of labor and a very different era. We need to be teaching our kids today the skills that they'll need for the 21st century economy. They need to learn how to do creative problem solving, critical reasoning, working collaboratively, skills that are required to live in a increasingly digital and networked age. That's going to take time. And it's important to make that investment up front. In the immediate term, we need to be heavily invested in vocational training. Mm-hmm. And you look at a market like Germany, and they've got it right, where there's not just one path you can pursue to ultimately be able to provide for yourself, your family, create economic opportunity for others. You can go to a higher educational organization, a traditional university, and study, but you can also go down a vocational path. And it's important, at least in the United States, that we recognize that it's not just about the university path. Traditionally here, I'm not sure that society thinks about vocational training in the same regard. And so to some extent, this is a cultural shift that needs to happen, to recognize the importance of learning a trade and making sure that kids today realize, and now people in the workforce realize, there's great pride to be taken in learning a skill and being able to generate value through that skill. If we could take just a fraction of the resources and the investments that are going into disrupting traditional universities and invest that into vocational training, that same kind of energy, and make it something that people are really aspiring to, I think we can see immediate change. And then that really works together with the second dimension, which is infrastructure. and making the right investments in technical infrastructure. And the first thing that comes to mind for me personally, and certainly for LinkedIn as a platform, is the way we leverage data to enable people to see where gaps exist and where opportunities are being created and how we can close those gaps. So, we can end kind of on a similar note to where we began with the economic graph. And while that is a vision, there are some very specific use cases that we're extremely excited about. And one of our favorites is this ability to leverage data flowing from the economic graph. So for any given locality, we can see where the fastest growing jobs are. We can see what skills are required to obtain those jobs, and we can see the aggregate skills of the workforce in that locality. And we can measure the gap. So to the extent that gap becomes prohibitively wide, we can start to alert vocational training facilities, junior colleges, even higher educational organizations, and say, this is not working. This is not in alignment. Here's data, and leverage this data to create a just-in-time curriculum. So you can train the people in the workforce for the jobs that are and will be, and not the jobs that once were. And our acquisition, we announced the acquisition of Lynda several weeks ago, which we're incredibly excited about. And that's really the last piece of that economic graph puzzle. It's one thing to be able to digitally represent the skills required to obtain jobs, to have the standardized data and see that you have these skills on your profile, these are the skills that the job requires, so you should close that gap. And it's another thing to actually be able to offer the coursework to make that possible. And so we're very excited about that.
And when you look at the future, you talk a lot about jobs, but in a 1099 economy, in a place where companies aren't actually creating the jobs, they're expecting the Uberization. You're going to work for someone for a brief period of time, so a lot of free agents. Is the economy is there anything else that needs to happen with the economy to get that workforce ready, or do companies need to react differently and start employing these people rather than outsourcing the work?
Well, I think it's both. I think the on-demand economy is a secular shift, and I think it's irreversible. And you hear stories increasingly of people living lives on their own terms, and it's very appealing for them, very attractive to be able to earn as much, if not more, than they were earning previously while working for an organization, now that they're essentially working on their own, leveraging these on-demand verticals and marketplaces. I think more broadly defined, those companies, those vertical marketplaces are going to require a different kind of infrastructure to support those individuals. And I think those individuals are going to need to learn new skills outside of their trade. Essentially, they all become their own small businesses. And so, everything from invoicing to paying taxes, these are the brass tacks that most people don't necessarily need to think about in the context of business. They think about it in the context of them as individuals. We all pay taxes, but it's something else altogether different when you're operating in a business for yourself. So I think infrastructurally, people will need to learn those skills. I think there's going to be enormous opportunities for the companies providing that kind of infrastructure. With regard to the company side of the equation as opposed to individuals, I think companies need to embrace the fact that individuals are being empowered in a way that they were never empowered previously. And so you can't stick to conventional wisdom in terms of the parameters you're defining and telling people how they can and cannot operate. People increasingly are going to be working from home. People increasingly are going to be working flexible hours. And the faster companies can embrace these changes, I think the more engaged their employees are going to be, the more value that's going to be created.
That's great. Well, Jeff, thank you very much.
Sure.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.